back, everyone, and it really gives me enormous pleasure to introduce Joe Labanyi today, who was really instrumental in creating, in launching, and in sustaining and propagating the whole cultural memory operation emanating from this institute, and I'm particularly grateful to Joe for it. Joe Labanyi is Professor of Spanish and Portuguese in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese Languages and Literatures at NYU, of course. She has external affiliations, including the Modern Language Association, the Asociación Internacional de Hispanistas, Association of Hispanists of Great Britain and Ireland, Asociación Internacional de Galdocistas, Asociación Española de Historiadores del Cine, Society for Cinema and Media Studies, and of course she's a fellow of the British Academy. Her research interests span Spanish literature and culture of the 19th and 20th century, film, especially film in the early Franco period, studies popular culture, memory, and cultural memory of course, and especially in relation to the Spanish Civil War. Joe has published extensively. I have a select list of publications here. Most recently, Spanish Literature with OUP in 2010, The Politics of Memory in Contemporary Spain, which is a monographic issue of Journal of Spanish Cultural Studies in 2008, Constructing Identity in Contemporary Spain, Theoretical Debates and Cultural Practice, still with OUP in 2002, and Gender and Modernization, I have a copy here, in the Spanish realist novel, also with OUP in the year 2000. Jo is holding editorial positions. She's founding editor of Journal of Spanish Cultural Studies and general editor of Remapping Cultural History book series with Bergman, of course. As Catherine mentioned, she was director of the Institute of Romance Studies between 1997 and 2002, and previously professor of Spanish and Cultural Studies at the University of Southampton from 2001 to 2005. So today she has a very intriguing title, Beyond Modern Languages, so with a question mark at the end, so over to you, Joe.
Thank you so much, Katja, for that really nice and generous introduction. Thank you for inviting me. I was delighted to be asked to come, and I'm even more grateful that the date was fixed so I could also be at a workshop at King's yesterday. Both events are very kindly invited, a lot of my favourite people, but I can sight and see them especially. Thank you so much, those of you who are here. I understand, in fact I know, that this nice invitation to give the keynote address to this symposium has got something to do with my having founded the Journal of Romance Studies in the year 2001 as a successor to the Journal of the Institute of Romance Studies. Michael Walton, who I'm delighted has been able to come, was one of the editors of that for French. The Journal of the Institute of Romance Studies was created originally by Malcolm Bowie. It was an excellent journal, but it was published in-house, and consequently we weren't able to distribute it well. The collaboration with Bergman significantly increased the journal's visibility, and the new arrangement with Liverpool University Press is going to do that even more so, since JRS is going to join Liverpool's existing bevy of journals in French, the Australian Journal of French Studies, Contemporary French Civilization, Francosphère, in Spanish, the Bulletin of Hispanic Studies, which I believe is the oldest journal in Spanish studies anywhere, and Catalan, the Catalan Review. That kind of critical mass seems crucial for high visibility. One thing I should say is that JRS is not, in my experience, well known in the US. Though, of course, I've got NY to subscribe to it, and I've encouraged some colleagues to send work to it. But mostly when I mention it to people, scholars in the States, they haven't heard of it. So if I may say so, that's something that I would recommend that Liverpool tries to work on. if only for the reason that junior colleagues in the States are reluctant to publish in a journal that's not well known in the States because they fear it's not going to help them get tenure. So I hope to see that change. Given my move to the States 11 years ago, my editorship of the other journal I founded in 2000, which Katia mentioned, the Journal of Spanish Cultural Studies, I come back as the coordinating editor of that now. I've assumed I should talk about journal publishing in the field of modern languages, as well as about the kind of intellectual configurations that are buoyant in the US Academy. I should say at the outset that founding those two journals is for me what I'm most proud of in my career, and I'm glad that they're both going strong. Given the vast number of university departments teaching Spanish in the US, my own department at NYU has over 1,000 students taking Spanish language classes, though only around 200 taking content courses for a Spanish major or minor. There are surprisingly few academic journals in the field published in the States. I'm not quite sure why there are so many excellent academic journals in the UK, not only in the field of modern languages, but it's very nice that the UK does take a lead in that respect. So this is going to be a hands-on talk. It's not going to be an inspiring piece of scholarship like those that we've heard earlier this afternoon. I titled it Beyond Modern Languages partly because that allowed me to talk about many things, but also because when I asked Catherine what kind of topic might be useful, she mentioned the perennial problem of modern language departments being seen by university administrations as service departments teaching language to students whose academic interests are in other fields. And of course that's a problem inscribed in the name of the Institute of Modern Language Research that publishes JRS and that is hosting us today, even though, to my knowledge, Kathy will correct me, you don't do any language teaching. That's correct? I suspect it's still true that scholars in departments of modern languages have to do more to prove their scholarly excellence than colleagues in departments of, say, English or history. Just as it used to be the case, maybe still is the case, that female scholars have to be twice as good to be perceived as equal to their male peers. The relationship between literary and cultural studies and linguistics can also be fraught, but in this case, with linguistics sometimes having the upper hand. That may be more true in the US than here. Speaking from the experience of certain US language departments that I know through friends, not my own, that include linguistics specialists as well as literary scholars, and where they live in a permanent state of war, with linguists monopolizing control and the budget because they can bring in big grant money as a social science field, whereas the funding available to their humanities colleagues who work on literature and culture is very modest. And I'm going to question that supposed divorce between the humanities and the social sciences a little bit later on, particularly thanks to Simon's wonderful presentation. And of course, in the States, Trump's budget, which hopefully will be contested in Congress, proposes to abolish all funding for the National Endowment for the Humanities, that would be the equivalent of the AHRC, as well as for the federally funded Title VI program of area studies, which straddles the humanities and social sciences. Last time the Title VI area studies program was threatened, it was saved by the Defense Department, who argued that the US needs to know about other parts of the world. So those of us who work on foreign cultures in the States may have to look to the military as our saviors. Well, I don't want to speculate about Brexit, it's too depressing. The loss of European funding to UK scholars is, I imagine, going to make worse the gap between the level of funding available to the humanities and the social sciences. I hope I'm wrong, since the European Union has been the source of really big funding for major projects on European culture. At the same time, on a positive note, as far as the UK is concerned, the US has nothing like the major funding for collaborative projects in the humanities offered by the AHRC. Funding for the humanities in the States is for individual research via release from teaching for a year, rather than for team projects which need bigger funding. In an individualistic academic culture like that of the US, the concept of collaborative research in the humanities simply doesn't exist, beyond co-authoring a book, which then in the States doesn't count for tenure or promotion. That's one thing I miss from my time in the UK, where research collaboration is encouraged, if only because it brings in big money. I also think it produces good research, different from the brilliant monograph, but often very innovative. I have to say, however, that the last time I reviewed research project funding applications for the AHRC, I was dismayed to have my reviews sent back for revision, because they didn't say enough in ranking applicants not only on impact factors, but also on leadership potential. I was looking forward to resigning, but then they dismissed me. Anyway, it was frustrating. The drift towards humanities projects that fit social science criteria is a major issue, though at least in the humanities we learn to analyse rhetoric and we know how to use language strategically to dress humanities projects up as making a practical contribution to society. But it is, I think, not that easy to make a project in the Romance languages sound useful to an increasingly insular United Kingdom. I found that in my reviews for the AHRC, that fabulous projects that I could see were going to be incredibly much of value for the cultures on which they were working, but to argue that they were going to benefit British society is actually very difficult. I mention all of this because it shows the importance of having good journals like JRS that showcase research excellence in the humanities and that demonstrate that modern languages research is humanities research at its best. In a Journal of Romance Studies, the issue obviously arises of how to bring together research on cultures in a number of languages in a way that's productive, that is, highlighting cultural difference while avoiding the sense of fragmentation. There are major political issues involved in working across languages in a world in which migration makes multilingualism more and more the norm, but also one where English is imposing itself as a global lingua franca, with English only on the rise in the US. The Trump administration took down the Spanish links on the White House website 15 minutes after the presidential inauguration. It's especially important that a Journal of Romance Studies works across languages, none of which are English. Working across languages also helps to critique the concept of national literature, which, like it or not, still dominates the teaching of literature, even in schools of modern languages that combine several languages together. In the States, they're called departments of foreign languages, a somewhat derogatory designation that is usually a sign that there's not a sufficient critical mass of faculty or students to have departments in the individual languages. I actually loved being in the School of Modern Languages at Southampton, and I don't see a School of Modern Languages as necessarily being in any way a diminishment of research because of the collaboration that can take place. Departments of Romance languages do exist in the States, however. Harvard is the most notable example. What is much stronger in the States than in the UK is departments of comparative literature. But even there, taking my own institution, NYU, as an example, the majority of faculty work on literature in one language, leaving it to the students to cross linguistic and national boundaries. I find that extraordinarily unfair. Comparative literature departments have, however, been important in criticising the concept of world literature, since it means literatures in languages other than English, that is, other people's literatures, reinforcing Anglocentric thinking, and it's usually taught in English translation. I'm thinking here of the critique of the teaching of literature in translation by my NYU Complit colleague Emily Apter in her book Against World Literature on the Politics of Untranslatability. The designation Romance languages fortunately doesn't impose any hierarchy on the languages concerned, and it supposes that various literatures will be discussed in the original language. Although we don't want to be seen as service departments, the teaching of foreign languages remains crucial as a humanistic endeavour that allows us to appreciate cultural difference, that is, untranslatability, as well as to establish connections. However, it's not easy to organise the contents of a journal that works across languages, so as to appeal to readers who don't know all the languages concerned. The number of readers proficient in French, Italian, Spanish and Portuguese, and I should also add Catalan and Galician, is likely to be minimal, sadly. The philological basis of Romance studies is as the study of those cultures that express themselves in a language derived from Latin, is clearly valid for the period of history when the Romance vernaculars were establishing themselves as vehicles of written as well as oral communication. It's harder to justify the grouping together of French, Italian, Spanish, Galician, Catalan and Portuguese on the basis of philological arguments when dealing with later periods. Geography suggests itself as a more plausible justification, since France, Italy, Spain and Portugal are neighbours, but the geographic rationale behind the concept of Romance studies produces problems too. One can argue on geographical grounds that the four countries concerned are bound together, at least partly in the case of France, by the idea of a European South. But the European South doesn't make sense if it excludes Southeast Europe, and one's bound to ask what is the relationship of the European South to the global South. That's a big topic in conflict departments in the States. I'm not sure if it's a big topic in the UK. I suspect that many French scholars would bridle at the suggestion that they work on the global South. Another configuration that I find very productive is that of the Mediterranean, particularly for the early modern period, as Brodel has shown us, but that too does not map squarely onto a geographical definition of Romance studies. For a start, Portugal is an Atlantic nation, and to cover the Mediterranean properly means including not only Southeast Europe, but also the Eastern Mediterranean and North Africa. It would be for the editors of the Journal of Romance Studies to decide whether an issue that includes not only those countries that speak a Romance language, but also other countries that border the Mediterranean will be part of the journal's brief. I don't see why not, personally. Then there's the issue of Romania, not on the Mediterranean, but technically a Romance language, albeit with heavy Slavonic influence, though it's hard to see what the history of Romania has in common with that of France, Italy, Spain and Portugal, apart from the Roman Empire and the fascist period, when there were links between Spanish and Romanian fascism, I assume with Italian fascism too. However, present-day Romanian migration to Western Europe, especially Spain, is a major social phenomenon that's been little studied by scholars in modern languages. I would like also to mention what strikes me as the quite extraordinary linguistic competence of the Romanian scholars that I've met. The only non-native speaker of Spanish students who we've accepted in my department's master's program in creative writing in Spanish was a Romanian who writes creative writing in Spanish, and she didn't even learn it as a migrant in Spain. She learned it exclusively in Romania, quite extraordinary. Another area that produces a complex geographical configuration is Sephardic studies, legitimately included in Romance studies through the varieties of 15th century Spanish, Portuguese and Catalan, spoken by the Jews expelled from Iberia, that is Sepharad in Hebrew, in the late 15th and early 16th centuries. Judeo-Espanol or Ladino survives today, preserved by communities who resettled in the Eastern Mediterranean and North Africa, and later in Latin America, the US or Israel. Judeo-Catalan and Judeo-Portuguese have not, to my knowledge, survived. even though Portuguese Jews formed the thriving diasporic community in Amsterdam, whose most illustrious progeny was, of course, Spinoza. These various comments suppose that geographical co-location is not a necessary criterion for cultural studies across the Romance languages, but that historical connection is fundamental. Of course, the two often go together. The search into cultural relations between Spain and Italy is seriously underdeveloped, apart from the period of Renaissance humanism. This despite the fact that the Kingdom of Naples and Sicily, later called Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, was ruled by a Spanish dynasty till liberated by Garibaldi in 1860. And despite the existence of strong links between Italy and the anti-Franco opposition, not just with neo-realist cinema, but also with militant cinema of the late Franco period and the subsequent transition to democracy, and also between Spanish and Italian feminism. I have a research student working on the first of those two topics, who I'd like to mention has a spectacular American Social Science Research Council grant, and I echo there Simon's point that we should all go for trying to get Social Science Research Council grants rather than assuming that there is a divorce between humanities and social science research. We shouldn't just be jealous of it, as I was implying at the beginning. I think there is less of a divorce between the humanities and the social sciences than we perhaps imagine. The last topic, the links between Spanish and Italian feminism, is one that, as far as I'm concerned, is crying out for research, if anybody would like to take that up. It is, of course, historical and not geographical connection that holds together the Francophone, Hispanophone, and Lusophone worlds and parts of Africa colonized by Italy, even though they're not Italian-speaking. This is where a Journal of Romance Studies can play an important role by going beyond Eurocentric conceptions of culture, so long as the study of former colonies in Latin America, the Caribbean, Africa, and Asia does not forget the existence of other languages in the area concerned. The plurilingual Caribbean is an obviously rich area for cross-cultural research, omitting Italian and also Portuguese, apart from Papiamento Creole, but including, in addition to French and Spanish, English, Haitian Creole, and Dutch. Again, I see no reason why such a configuration could not be included under the aegis of a Journal of Romance Studies, so long as at least two Romance languages form part of the discussion. A topic that obviously needs tackling here is the way in which the imposition of the language of the colonizer has been justified as part of a civilizing mission. Critical discussion of how such discourses have played out across Francophone, Hispanophone, and Lusophone cultures would make interesting and important comparative study. Francoist intellectuals, in propagating the idea of Hispanidad, Hispanicity, as compensation for the loss of empire, will want to talk of Spain's generosity in giving Spanish to the Philippines, blindly ignoring the fact that the friars who controlled the archipelago taught the local population in Tagalog to avoid them gaining access to Spanish as the language of the colonial administration, with the result that when the Americans took over the Philippines and implanted compulsory education in English, Spanish was lost in a couple of generations, apart from the continued use of Spanish first names. The contemporary discourse of the Spanish government agency responsible for the worldwide teaching of Spanish, the Instituto Cervantes, still today talks about Spanish as a single language that binds Latin America to Spain. The most recent dictionary of the Spanish Royal Academy caused a furore in the States when it defines Spanglish as, quoting an English translation, a deformation of Spanish spoken in the United States. The sociolinguist José Labanyi at CUNY Graduate Center launched an email protest campaign. His big moment was when the Mexican movie star Gael García Bernal signed up to the protest. The Spanish embassy in Washington bases its cultural outreach on the assumption, and I've heard them say this, that the way to increase commercial relations between Spain and the US is to appeal to the Latino population, showing complete blindness to the fact that Latinos in the States, although they speak Spanish, have not the slightest interest in or sense of commonality with Spain. As these examples show, there's a danger in the philological conception of Romance studies, as the studies of cultures that have a common linguistic heritage, of seeing non-European French, Spanish and Portuguese-speaking cultures as derivative of Europe, a danger that obviously has to be resisted. In the States, where Europe figures very little in the mindset by comparison with the interest in Latin America or in American or hemispheric studies, any statement that implies such a Eurocentric conception will get shouted down. A case in point is the new configuration of Iberian studies that's being proposed as a way of bringing together study of the different languages of the Iberian Peninsula, that is Portuguese, Spanish, Catalan, Galician and Basque. If such a configuration is extended to include those parts of the world colonized by Spain and Portugal, it inevitably becomes problematic. And that's something that was discussed yesterday at a workshop at King's, which is developing an extremely interesting program in global Iberias. Despite the good intentions, the term global Iberias necessarily supposes Europe as cultural origin. The configurations increasingly used in the US are transatlantic studies, which I understand is also important here, and trans-Pacific studies. While these are producing interesting work, especially in the more recent trans-Pacific studies, by highlighting the importance of cultural traffic, concepts like transatlantic and trans-Pacific leave out those aspects of the various national cultures that did not travel or that traveled in a different direction. If the term transatlantic studies is used just to mean a mix of Latin American and Iberian authors, it frankly becomes meaningless, and that does happen, I'm sorry to say, more than one would like. Transatlantic studies does, however, have the advantage of allowing us to include Western Africa in the configuration, and is thus crucial for the study of slavery, which has taken off in Spanish and American studies. I'm delighted to see from Judith's talk that also in French studies, and obviously is hugely important in Brazilian studies. Transatlantic studies also allows inclusion of Portuguese-speaking Angola. Spain's West African colonies don't really fit, because in their case the trade was between Africa and the European metropolis. But transatlantic studies separates the study of Angola from the study of Portuguese-speaking Mozambique, which is on the Indian Ocean. The MLA's recent reconfiguration of its subject areas contemplated creating Indian Ocean studies on the principle that maybe cultures should be grouped around oceans and not around continents. I was delighted to see, on checking out the JRS webpage, I thought I should do my homework for this talk, that issue 14.2, published in 2014, was devoted to oceans, including the Indian Ocean. The MLA, however, backed off from such a bold move, a shame since, among other reasons, the traffic between Portuguese-controlled Goa and East Africa is an interesting field of study that scholars in Portugal have taken up. Incidentally, in this recent reconfiguration of its subject areas, the MLA abolished the previous grouping Romance Literary Relations. The new MLA subject configuration is quite interesting in revealing difficulties in knowing what to do with plurilingual nations and with languages that span more than one nation. In the case of Spanish and Portuguese, the subject configuration's organization on linguistic principles hit some major problems and ended up producing an incoherent mix of linguistic and geographic categories. The Italian subject area is simple, comprising 3 forums for first medieval and Renaissance, second 17th to 19th centuries, and third 20th to 21st centuries. French, too, is straightforward. 6 forums on the various periods from the Middle Ages to the present, but only one on Francophone, meaning all parts of the world that speak French apart from France. Spanish produced the biggest problem. I was chair of the Contemporary Spanish Division Committee at the time, and the MLA working group charged with the reconfiguration got fed up with our objections to every solution they suggested, to the point that they gave up and opted for a compromise solution that satisfied no one. Our division committee had actually made what we thought was an entirely viable proposal, which was to subsume all the different languages of the Iberian Peninsula, including Portuguese, under the umbrella term Iberian, with Latin American as a separate subject area. But the MLA rejected that on the spurious grounds that people wouldn't manage to find Spanish or Portuguese if it was listed under Iberian. Give people much credit. The final configuration, and sorry I'm spending a bit of time on this because I find it weirdly fascinating. The final MLA configuration created separate subject areas for Catalan and Galician. Basque didn't make it, with another subject area comprising Spanish and Iberian, containing 5 chronologically defined forums, as well as a separate subject area called Latin American, with 6 forums defined by a mix of chronology and geography, but oddly excluding Brazil. Additionally, under the comparative literature subject area, the MLA created a new forum, Global Hispanophone. Latin American and Iberian, of course, are geographic and not linguistic categories. The most problematic label is Spanish and Iberian, since it supposes that Spanish is not part of Iberian, apart from the fact that Spanish is a linguistic designation, whereas Iberian is a geographic term. The reason or reasons for opting for the counterintuitive Spanish and Iberian was that it allowed inclusion of both the multilingual medieval period before Spain was created as a nation in the late 15th century, that is Iberian, and of subsequent periods, Spanish. And it also allowed panels for the modern period to include speakers on Basque, which was otherwise homeless, and on Catalan, Galician and Portuguese, which had their own separate subject areas that by implication could not include speakers on the other languages of the Iberian Peninsula. Global Hispanophone, a subset of comparative literature and separate from Latin American, basically means the other bits of the Spanish-speaking world that no one knew what to do with, since they don't fit into Europe or the Americas. Anyway, the Journal of Spanish Cultural Studies is next year publishing a double monographic issue on global Hispanophone, which will try to work out what this new label might mean. The MLA didn't do much better with its Portuguese subject area, which ended up with 2 forums, Luso-Brazilian, which is separate from Latin American, and Global Portuguese, which includes Portugal. Thus, Portugal gets separated off from Iberian because that comes under Spanish. This division of the Portuguese subject area into Luso-Brazilian on the one hand and Global Portuguese, including Portugal, on the other, makes it clear that in the US, which is little interested in Europe, Brazil is what matters, while Portugal is regarded as an outpost, recognized mainly as the suppliers of whalers to the US northeast. That has been the major source of Portuguese migration to the States. Problems also arose during this reconfiguration of subject areas with the fact that Spanish is the second language of the United States. The US is the second biggest Spanish-speaking country after Mexico. The MLA's American subject area includes a range of forums, 2 of which are Latino studies and then literatures of the United States in languages other than English. This implicitly divides Latino studies into that which is written in English and that which is written in Spanish. This accurately but sadly reflects the fact that Latino studies in the US has been monopolized by English departments, with the result that only Latino literature in English gets taught. My own department of Spanish and Portuguese at NYU recently got a joint appointment in Latino Studies with English, which allows us to teach Latino literature in both English and Spanish. This is surprisingly rare, despite the fact that the whole point of Latino literature is that it's written by authors who are bilingual. I'm not sure what kind of linguistic map the Journal of Romance Studies is thinking of drawing to encompass the areas of the world it will cover, but I hope it will be less incoherent than what the MLA came up with. With regard to the practical question of how to put together an issue of a Journal of Romance Studies that will grab readers who are unlikely to have a command of all the languages concerned, one obvious option, and JRS has done this frequently, is to earmark certain issues for essays on material in only one language. But that can't be done too often, or one will lose readers whose interests are in the other languages. So I'm assuming that most issues will continue to work across languages. In this respect, I think it's not enough to put together a selection of examples on, for example, the modern city in literature in French, Italian, Spanish, and Portuguese. There has to be some driving intellectual issue or research question that holds the articles together beyond sharing a common subject matter. That so what factor that we all tell our research students to consider when choosing a research topic. An example of what makes a good cross-cultural monographic issue is in fact provided by JRS's issue 14.3 of 2014 on mutating cities, palimpsestic traces in the urban context. The concept of the palimpsest holds together the various articles in this issue extremely well. Another example of an exciting cross-cultural project that I'd like to mention from my personal recent experience is not actually a journal issue, though it would make a fantastic topic for a monographic journal issue, but a recent PhD dissertation in Comp Lit at NYU, for which I was privileged to be on the dissertation committee. The topic was the peasant question in late 19th and early 20th century literature, ranging across novels in English, French, Spanish, Italian, Russian, Greek, Bulgarian, and Albanian. The student was Albanian. All those literatures, apart from the stunning linguistic expertise, were held together by a major critique of the assumption that the peasant is an anachronism in modernity, moving the literary analysis into the terrain of environmental studies. The monographic issue is, in my view, a great way not only to produce a good read, but more importantly, to drive the field forward in innovative ways, especially if journal editors are proactive at talent spotting and reaching out to interesting scholars, especially young ones, and working with them to shape up a monographic issue proposal. In the US, monographic issues in a top journal are given more importance than edited books. I'm not sure if that's the case currently in the UK, but I do remember when I first joined the AHRC Peer Review College, while I was still in the UK, I was told that the impact of a journal, which is mostly read online, can be vastly greater than that of a book, and I think that's very important advice. Since no funding is required to put together a monographic journal issue, it can be a way of encouraging the kind of research that is not social sciencey enough to get research funding, but which involves thinking outside the box. From personal experience as editor of the Journal of Spanish Cultural Studies, I think it's not enough to rely on submissions coming in if one wants to shape the field. One can go about this from two ends, either by mapping out some exciting emerging fields and approaching someone who could put together a special issue in the particular field concerned, or by spotting a scholar doing out-of-the-box research and asking them to shape up a special issue that positions itself in or creates a new field. Whichever the end from which one starts, networking and attending conferences are essential. I very much like the section in JRS that reports on interesting conferences. That's something that not that many journals do. I'd hope that the authors of these reports can play a major role in tipping the journal's editors off about especially innovative papers, so that the editors can approach the scholar or scholars concerned. And indeed, that the writers of the reports might, while at the conference, suggest to those scholars that they consider sending their work to JRS, especially in the case of younger scholars who might not think of doing so. In that respect, I find that one of the most gratifying things about being the journal editor is being able to encourage young scholars by taking an interest in their work. An example that I'm particularly pleased about is a forthcoming issue of the Journal of Spanish Cultural Studies on sound cultures in Spain, which arose from being inspired by the work of a particular young scholar from here in the UK, and asking if he might consider putting a monographic issue together. So, to conclude, what kind of topics might make good monographic issues? It's probably my personal bias that makes me single out topics that stand at the intersection of more than one discipline, as in the peasant question topic that I mentioned before, and I was pleased that Simon said something similar with his ERC project as well. By that I mean topics that lend themselves to exploration from a range of disciplines. That would mean, in the case of JRS, publishing research by scholars who don't necessarily work, or at least not all of them, in departments of language and literature, but who study some form of cultural production or practice in parts of the world that speak a Romance language. That may not be where JRS's editors want to go. I'm expressing a purely personal preference. Environmental studies, to mention that again, strikes me as a good example of an emerging field that intersects with many disciplines and brings together exciting recent theoretical work in the new materialisms and in animal studies, meaning the questioning of the boundary between the human and the non-human, as well as drawing on the more established theoretical corpus in biopolitics. Environmental studies might even sound social sciencey enough, I think it certainly does, to attract major research funding. I'd like at this closing point to mention the area I'm currently working in, the history of emotions, not because of my own work, but because it's a field that can contribute and is contributing to some major rethinking of cultural assumptions. For a start, it's led to a questioning of the romantic notion of emotion as the authentic core of the individual self, a kind of personal property that defines the self, a concept that is, of course, highly gendered. The work on emotions that's been done since 2004 by Sarah Ahmed in the UK, and more recently by Lauren Berlant and Sian Nagai, among others, in the States, has proposed a reading of the emotions as occurring at the interface between self and world, in such a way that the concept of the self is displaced and emotions are seen as social and political interventions and as forms of thought, rather than being seen as in opposition to reason, because they are about the world. What particularly interests me is the historical aspect of the history of the emotions. That is, the demonstration of how the emotions have been conceived differently over a time, and of course are conceived differently in different cultures, which no doubt means that they've been experienced differently as well. A particularly interesting topic is how the vocabulary for talking about the emotions has changed. Indeed, the word emotion is an early 19th century invention, coinciding with the Romantic period. The word is found in English in the 16th century, but the terms used in the pre-modern period to designate what we now call emotions were passions and affects or affectations, all of which were presumed to enter the self from the outside, to affect one, rather than being the core of an inner self. The 18th century sees the rise of sensibility as a complement to reason that binds the self to the polity, morphing by the later 18th century into a notion of sentiment as the mark of an inner self, increasingly coming to be seen as in conflict with reason rather than its complement. The Romantic period will consecrate the notion of emotion as in open conflict with reason. The term emoción does not appear in the Spanish Royal Academy Dictionary until 1843, after a decade of intensive use in the romantic historical novel of the 1830s. Current affect theory, which defines affect as a preconscious energetic charge that impacts on the individual at an epidermic level, thus contrasting violently with the romantic notion of emotion as the core of individual subjectivity, is in some ways a return to the pre-modern theorization of the affects, a nice example of how cultural history does not follow a straight line. I mention this, I'm moving towards my end now, in relation to the organisation of monographic journal issues, because while work across disciplinary boundaries is now accepted and encouraged, much more in the UK than the US, I should say, what is hardly ever done is work that crosses historical boundaries. By that, I don't mean work that is transhistorical in the sense of ignoring historical specificity, but quite the opposite. Work that brings together the expertise of scholars working on different periods to analyse how concepts and the vocabulary used to express them have changed across the centuries. That can only be done by a team of scholars, each with the required historical expertise, whether in the form of a collaborative project or in the form of a monographic journal issue. I would love to see that kind of collaboration across historical boundaries happen.